their stories. I know that I'm always like excited and thrilled and elated, but I'm extra excited today because I get to interview a wonderful colleague and dear friend, Anne Mauro. And let me tell you why Anne is so amazing and special. Anne is a licensed couples and family therapist, American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, ASIC certified sex therapist, sexuality educator, sex therapy supervisor, and American Association of Marriage and Family Therapy clinical supervisor. Her private practice is nestled in the interwebs on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish people in Washington state. She has two publications, More Than Ebony and Ivory, Complexities of Sex Therapy with Interracial Couples, which can be found in an intersectional approach to sex therapy, centering the lives of Indigenous, racialized, and people of color, and also the wonderful book, Colonization of Black Sexualities, a clinical guide to relearning and healing. Anne is in continued service to the sexuality community by serving as the ASIC Western representative to the nominating committee. And Anne is just one of the most wonderful, kind, generous, and incredibly smart colleagues I know. So that's why I'm extra thrilled to have you with us for Gender Stories today. And welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I'm extra honored because I know I'm a fan of the podcast, and hear you say, I know I always say this. And I'm like, yeah, you always say that because you always have awesome guests on your podcast. So it's just an honor to be now a part of that roster of people.
Oh my God, I just feel honored that you've made the time for this. And I know that I love the mutual kind of love for each other's work and for each other that we have. And so hopefully we'll have a great conversation for our listeners as well, or folks who are watching maybe on YouTube now that I put the podcast on YouTube as well as all the different podcasting platforms. So enough of that. Let's just really get into it. And I am really curious. We never talked about this, actually. What drew you to sex therapy in the first place, right? I mean, I know you're a marriage and family therapist, but then you're really committed to our field and you give so much to the field of sex therapy. So why sex therapy?
Yeah, I think originally, what happened, I was in community college and I took a psychology class and a human sexuality class at the same time, and something kind of clicked in me like, oh my gosh, I want to do something with these two things. And then at that time, what I thought it would be more like forensics. I was really into sex crimes and understanding like the deviance around sexuality. And then I became a parent and had a little person I was taking care of. And as you know, sometimes you can't censor what you hear on the news. And I heard a news story that maybe motherhood wouldn't have activated me like it did. But it was then I decided, you know what? I don't think I can be in the criminalization of sex anymore. I think I would really like to help people with enrichment and pleasure and joy and not live in that dark space. So that's kind of how it started and evolved into me doing what I do now.
I love that. And I also love that kind of trajectory, which makes sense to me because I feel like in psychology, sometimes there is more of an emphasis on like, what is different from the norm, right? What is more pathological? But then coming into this more expansive place. But what if we supported people in being more liberated, in having more access to pleasure, right? Having more connection and intimacy with themselves and each other. So I love that journey. And like I said, we never talked about this actually. And you are incredibly committed to the field. Tell me a little bit more about why it is so important for you to serve in a professional association, to really serve in the field and bring that kind of that volunteer time really, on top of being a parent, on top of being a sex therapist and educator. Like why service is so important to you?
Right now, professionally, I feel like I'm in my full-blown auntie space, right? I feel like there's a level of sex therapists that are coming up under us, right? Our supervisees or just a whole different generation that are having a different experience that you and I had
Yeah.
because of people like you and I carving a space out for them. And so there wasn't somebody that really looked like me that was available for supervision for ASEC, and especially in Washington at the time, being able to provide that as a service or to have leadership roles, right? For people to see me in a leadership role, I think is really important. So other people can see that it's possible for them. And then for my voice to be heard and for hopefully to keep making changes in the right direction where everybody has a seat at the table.
Absolutely. And I love that because, and for folks who don't know, historically, the field of sex therapy is very white, very cisgender, pretty straight with a few exceptions, incredibly white. I know I'm saying this twice, but it's really worth saying twice because so deeply, colonized in some way. And we'll talk about the decolonization of sexuality in a minute. And so I really feel that importance, right, of representation, of showing folks who are kind of coming after us, like, no, there is a space for you, and actually your voice is really, really essential. And so I really appreciate all that you give to the field and how important your presence in the field is. Speaking of which, let's talk about your publications, because not only you give, you serve the field, you're a supervisor, you're a mentor. I've met some of your wonderful supervisees and mentees, and they're incredible. And I'm just so excited about how the field is changing and what ASIC is today compared to 15 or 20 years ago, We could talk about that, but we won't. I would much rather talk about your work. For example, this wonderful book right here that I had the privilege to read even before it got published. And so, The Colonization of Black Sexuality, a clinical guide to relearning and healing, that's published by Routledge. It seems like a small book, but it's so packed with amazing information. And before we got into it, why did you feel moved to write this book in the first place?
Well, let me back this up because I think this is actually important. I was not a studious kid in school. I'm really not sure how I got through public education, and history was non-existent. I don't remember learning about even basic US history, right? And so the work that I've been doing post-grad in these publications has just been me trying to understand the history and how it's impacted modern day sexuality, right? So that was kind of my voyage, my history lesson. And then I was given the opportunity to talk just about how it impacted Black bodies when it came to this publication right here.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's talk about that, because I feel like that really, especially here on Turtle Island, so-called United States of America, that impact, is really felt intergenerationally, the impact of slavery, the impact of that colonization of Black, brown, and indigenous bodies. And so what is it that you see in terms of the ongoing systemic violence, including sexual violence, and, and the impact on kind of Black folks today that feels really connected historically to that kind of history of colonization and slavery as well?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that we just see so many trends that they're almost insidious, and that we think that they're part of our culture. I feel like a lot of times I don't know if your listeners have seen the Matrix trilogy, or if you have.
But I love the Matrix, and we even had Tilly on the podcast talking about the Matrix as a trans allegory. So yeah, let's talk about the Matrix.
That one. Well, how I like to explain it though is that we're literally plugged in, right? And you don't even notice it until you're unplugged, that there's something else bigger and larger that's been happening for a very long
Mm-hmm.
time. And so for me, it's just completely insidious and like underground. So if I can just even bring it back to where I'm at, I'm on the Coast Salish territory, Duwamish territory. A
Mm-hmm.
treaty was signed, of course, still not upheld. They're fighting to be federally
Yeah.
recognized. But what just really gets me is that here people don't understand that out of the top 10 cities with the most missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, we're number one. And if you talk to anybody, you know, out here, most people don't even
Mm-hmm.
know that this epidemic, this violence against brown women, right? They think that, oh, colonization is an event from the past, right? It's like, no,
Mm-hmm.
systems and structures have been put in place that still make it okay for people or some people to think it's okay to harm brown bodies, right? As
Yeah.
evidenced by we're number two for the top 10 states with the missing and murdered
Yeah.
Indigenous folks. So,
Mm-hmm.
so is that as the backdrop, right? And then we also seem to sprinkle it in, like I'm saying, it's like the water we drink. I was
Mm-hmm.
just talking
Yes.
about how even in pornography, let's talk about
Mm-hmm.
ethnic themed pornography.
Yes.
Higher chances that you're going to see violence against brown women, right?
Mm-hmm.
Unconsensual behaviors towards Asian women, right? There's just so much that we're being fed, even if we're not talking about erotica, just the general media, right?
Absolutely.
About
Mm-hmm.
black and brown bodies and how they are treated. So it's just a continuation of a different color, you know.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, we're both passionate about this, about that thread historically, right? That actually the ongoing like decolonization is ongoing, right? This is
Mm-hmm.
ongoing. It kind of never stopped. And you already talked about the intersection of gender and race as well, right? Like, you know, it is Black and brown women and Two-Spirit folks who are the most kind of missing and murdered in our state, to where I live on Dakota and Anishinaabe territories as well. And there is an intersection there around gender and race. And I know that there's also Black women who talked about the impossibility of Black womanhood in the context of womanhood only really being seen as white womanhood, right? When we talk about protecting women and children, they might as well say white women and children, because they're not talking about protecting Black and brown women and children. Because if we were protecting Black and brown women and children, we would be living in a very different world. And so let's talk about the intersection of gender and race, and kind of what you found as you were doing this work in your book about that intersection specifically.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know that we were just talking about women, but one of the things that was more eye-opening for me is this narrative that we've had throughout education, that victims were just women, right? There's
Mm-hmm.
just the
Yeah.
cis woman victimhood, which could be evidenced by giving birth, right? So we
Yeah.
know that women were being raped because of all these mulatto
Mm-hmm.
children, right? And then
Yeah.
discounting people that could not give birth, or people who were too young to give birth.
Yeah.
But in thinking about the gender piece, and part of this goes back into patriarchy, right? So when the English settlers came, they came
Mm-hmm.
kind of with a family mimicking the Commonwealth, a man in charge,
Yeah.
like a god or a king over the family, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if you think about an enslaved man, of what it means to be a man who would be able to protect his women and children, has that completely stripped from him. And then the
Mm-hmm.
psychic toll that it must take to also be seen as the perpetrator, right? As a violent perpetrator, as a
Mm-hmm.
rapist,
Yes.
meanwhile
Absolutely.
having no autonomy over your own reproduction,
Mm-hmm.
and could be used, right? I was just talking about erotica, right? So back when the transatlantic slave trade had to stop importing bodies from Africa to the United States, there was a mass breeding that was
Mm-hmm.
happening with the masters to create more enslaved
Yeah.
people to work, right? And so during this time came terms like stud, right? They would try to
Yeah.
breed people with
Hmm.
stud, and this is where this big black cock, and they were
Yeah.
forcing rape, but being seen as a perpetrator and not the actual victim. And so that psychic toll of not being able to protect, which means, you know, a
Hmm.
patriarch as a man, you protect your women,
Absolutely.
children, you provide, um, and then having it also turned that you are a sexual predator. Meanwhile, we
Hmm.
are eliciting sexual violence on you. That was that
Absolutely.
intersection of even thinking about how do we think about violence and gender, right?
Absolutely.
And
And yeah, and it's like even for, when I think about Black boys and even the impossibility of childhood, actually for all Black and brown children, right? Because there is the hypersexualization, they're being seen already, like, and we know like the systemic violence by the police against children, right, who should not be seen as a threat, but just being in a Black and brown body mind in this country, like inherently makes you a threat to kind of the white colonial policing state. But how insidious it is, right? It's like really baked in, like you said, like the water we drink or the air we breathe. There's just so much trauma. And so how do you find then, one of the things I loved about the book is that really it makes it clear that we have to unlearn and relearn, right? We need to understand where we've been to be more effective in our work, right? And if we don't do this work, we might actually do a lot of harm to our clients. And I've seen clients being harmed by therapists who don't have the kind of critical, knowledgeable lens and they haven't done their work, right? And so let's talk a little bit about what you see nowadays when you work with clients, where you see that direct connection between like that violence that was inflicted not even that long ago, honestly, on families and individuals and communities, right? And the challenges that folks face in kind of relating to their own bodies, to each other's bodies, to their sex and sexuality. Yeah, what do you notice in your practice?
mm-hmm. Well, what I feel like any of the presenting problems that come in, I feel like we can trace back to, is there like this historical component behind this? Is there the
Mm,
political or a legal component behind this? And then how is it represented right
yeah.
now, right? And
Hmm.
so I'm not sure if I made my point back around when I was even talking about porn. So something that we see right now is like you still see BBC, Big Black Cock, or Stud,
Yeah, that's
right?
true.
You're seeing
Hmm.
really racialized
Yeah.
marketing around it that becomes so insidious that we don't even see it. And then we can
Hmm.
have also some internalized sexual racism because your body isn't measuring up to this standard of what you are being racialized or
Hmm.
being gendered to be.
Yeah, absolutely. That is a lot to carry, not, but that's a lot to carry for you as a scholar and also as a therapist. I can't imagine, I don't know about you, but I know when I was writing gender trauma, it was a hard book to write because you feel the impact, right? As you go through all that data, as you go through all that history and you process it and put it on the page. And so I'm wondering what that process was like for you as a biracial Black woman, kind of really bringing that knowledge and that history to the page, like in terms of your own process, if that makes sense.
I think it was a miserable process
Yeah.
for me. It was really so nice to hear that other people have suffered in the same way that I did not. Like I thought, oh, if I ever write a book, it's going to be so much pleasure and joy, and I'm just going to love it so much. And it was hard,
Mhm.
and sometimes almost freezing me in my steps and wanting to really be respectful and honor the dead, right? And I felt like there was other things listening to what I was writing, not just the human beings that were picking up the book, but it was tapping
Absolutely.
into something. And I wanted to be respectful and honor that space.
Hmm. That makes so much sense to me. Even as you're talking, I'm feeling like yeah, that almost ancestral weight, responsibility. I don't know what the connection, what the word is, but it's just like bringing all of that onto a page is not easy, and it is a responsibility. I mean, you did it beautifully, I think, in the book, and it's really essential reading. I think, like, I really believe this is essential reading, not just for sex therapists, but sex educator, any clinician really should read this. But not only read this, also think about how does it apply today, right? Because we
Mm-hmm.
see it everywhere. Like you said, we see it in porn. We've even seen it at the Olympics, right? When I think about what happened with the Monica Leaf, and the
Mm-hmm.
questioning of her gender, which again, not new, right? We know that especially Black women athletes have had their womanhood questioned, right? That so we have both kind of Black excellence on one side, but on the other side, like, well, if it's too much excellence, now we're questioning like your gender, your womanhood, almost like if Black womanhood can be revoked or something, if somebody is too strong or too good at what they do, right? So it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere, and so it's not just when you're writing the book, but this is like every day you navigate this. And what is that like for you to navigate that in your day-to-day life when you're on social media, watching TV, doing your work, right? It's all the time. What is that experience like for you, if that makes sense?
Mhm. And maybe that also increased the intensity of doing the work in the book, because I have to highlight too, it was being written during the pandemic, during the
Mhm.
Black Lives Matter
I was
movement, during my
wondering.
own
Mhm.
um, trying to understand the world and how it was being jostled and responding to the jostling.
Yeah.
Um, so I think it maybe fueled some of the fire. I think also I want to say that one of the reasons why I fell in love with you academically is because you really put together I feel like there's a bunch of dots, right? People are not connecting the dots from what has happened to what is happening, right? I think there's some
Yes.
good intention of people trying,
Hmm.
but when I opened your book, I was like, oh, and we can cuss on this podcast, right?
Yeah, we
I was,
can.
I
Yeah,
was like,
absolutely.
oh shit, you got it. You connected the dots, and I think that's what's really important. I think for a lot of us is connecting all those pieces together.
Yeah, and I'm with you because it's like, and honestly, I was like, I don't know if this is going to make sense outside of my brain, but we need to connect the dots because people don't get it. Like you said, they think,
Mm-hmm.
oh, slavery, it's in the past, colonization in the past. And I'm like, no, it's every day, everywhere. It's like, even as a parent, right? I see how pervasive it is and how important it is to talk to my kids, about how we're racialized, how we're gendered, the responsibility they have in the world as, in an age appropriate way, but still making sure they know what it means to move in a white body mind in this world, especially in their relationship, friendships, all of that. And because the dots are right there, right? But I think that it's very intentional that we can't connect them, right? Because if we think those things are in the past and now everything is okay and we're all equal and, all this beautiful sentiment that people are like, I don't see color, or I don't see this, or I don't. And I'm like, this is actually terrible that you don't see it because it's there, and if you don't see it, it means that you're actually still plugged into the matrix, to go back to that. So, right? You're still kind of drinking the Kool-Aid and don't see that actually not everybody's having the same experience. Not everybody is navigating the world in the same way. And I think we've seen that definitely during the uprising, during the pandemic. We keep seeing it right now, right? It's exhausting. Um, how are you nourishing yourself, finding joy and support in this exhausting world. Because it is exhausting. And I feel like sometimes, I don't know about you, but I mean, I talk a lot about trauma because I do a lot of trauma work, but it is exhausting. It's exhausting as a therapist, as a human, as a parent. I can't even imagine how much more exhausting it is for you as a biracial Black woman. So, how do you find that support, that care, that just that breath, that help us get through the day?
That's the biggest one is the breath, right? Because sometimes that's all we literally. I know we both have had busy lives, and so taking that moment to actually take a breath. I'm gonna take one right now. That's my number one. That's my best friend right there. Is that breath, and when I get to breathe in and check in if my shoulders are up to my ears, I get to let them go, and always reminding myself that there's that feedback loop. And so if I'm feeling that anxiousness in my body, then it's going to feed into my brain. And so trying to calm. I've always been a person that needed like the TV on, radio, music. But I'm finding now with doing all of this work how powerful silence is for me. Because I'm seeing even how television, even left in the background, is moving my mood a little bit. Like the theme of what's happening, the theme music, all of that is actually also compressing on top of the life that I lived that day. And so turning off and not hearing anything except for the birds, my dog snoring, whatever that is, I'm finding a lot of rest and healing in that nothing space.
Oh, that's beautiful. And I love that you mentioned rest because it can be so difficult to rest. I don't know about you, but right, there's so much work to do. I don't think it's an accident that you're so service oriented. I feel like every minoritized therapist and educator I know is very service oriented for all the reasons that you so beautifully listed earlier. But that can bring some level of like exhaustion and burnout with it too, right? Because it's like, that you can never turn off in some ways, right? It's just like, it's our lives. It's not just like, oh, I do this work and then I can forget about it, right? No, because this is not just work. It's also like your lived experience, is your day to day. And so have you found kind of ways to access more rest for yourself? Or yeah, how are you doing with rest under late stage capitalism? And because it's a thing, and I know we're both like the main breadwinners for our families. It's not easy to like do all the things, especially when you're also doing service and rest enough. So yeah, how are you doing with that?
I'm a work in progress. I always tell my clients that it's like an act of resistance, right? And so I have to really actively be active about giving myself rest and then not feeling guilty about the resting.
Absolutely.
So that's the part that I have. It's like, oh yeah, I'm resting, but I should be. The laundry needs to be changed, and so now it's like my work is kind of moving into giving myself permission to reprioritizing what I thought was something that had to be done. Like I used to think emails had to be done, and now I know that I can respond differently and not in urgency. Capitalism told me to do things fast and efficient. And I feel like being slow is being more efficient for me. Also, self-disclosure, have put screen time limits on my phone. So I won't get news updates or email updates at certain times of the day because that's not my time to focus on that. I feel like we're really distractible now. And so I'm trying to eliminate some of that distraction so I can keep on centering here.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to talk about this because I don't know, but I often say to my clients, like, it's important that we don't compare our insides to other people outsides, because even other people have told me, oh, you do so much. And like, you're on the go, and I'm like, and you do this and you do that. And I'm like, yeah. And 90% of the time, I'm like overwhelmed and exhausted, and I'm actually trying to do less, right? And so I think that it is important to have those conversations and to be like, it is a struggle, right? This is not what we have been so indoctrinated to, like, do the thing, do it fast. Like I feel so guilty that I have 2 months of unanswered emails right now in my inbox, and I'm like, oh, I can't, I should stay up and like answer those emails, and my body is just like, absolutely not. Peace out. I literally, my brain nowadays shuts down. I used to be able to push through, but as I age, I can't even do that. And so I don't think that we talk enough about this is too much. At some point, like, when do we all wake up and go, this is not working for us, really? Like, we need to do something different. And talking about doing something differently, what is your hope? When you wrote this book, this beautiful book, what is the hope, your hope that people would learn, especially your colleagues, maybe especially your white colleagues, would get out of this book, in terms of kind of learning and changing?
My hope was that it was connecting some dots, right? It's not just,
Yeah.
these things that happened and here we are, but actually making it make sense for more people, to give more insight into it, maybe more language specifically around it, but at least seeing the connection.
Yeah.
Was my hope.
Absolutely. And do you feel like, have you had good feedback from other colleagues that are like, yes, this was helpful, this helped me look at things differently? Or
Yes, I have, and the white colleagues too. I do have a section for white colleagues, white supervisors, and too, and have had some good feedback around those exercises that I have them work through.
That's wonderful. And are there some, maybe an exercise or something that you could share with the listeners in terms of, if they're like, yeah, I do want to connect the dots, I do want to better understand how those things link up, and what is it that I need to do differently in my day-to-day life to move towards a more liberated world for all of us? Yeah. And if not, that's okay too. But just wonder if there's like just something that could be shared if people are listening and are interested in this work.
Yeah. Well, what I find when I've been teaching this material or in writing the book is I'm not saying too many new things to Black people or other people of color, right?
Yeah.
It's really new news for white people. They'll when I ask about certain things like the Tuskegee experiment, right?
Yeah.
Not everybody in the room knows what I'm talking about. I work in predominantly white spaces, right? And so, so I feel like a lot of this work is on the white folks at this time, and I thought for myself that a part of the liberation was to understand the history. I was like, I got to understand where I'm coming from before I can get to this liberation piece. And now that I've got the history, I'm working on the liberation. I don't have the answers for it. But I think that if you are a white person wanting to do this work, that doing this work with other white people or people of your culture is really important, because I see people like, oh, I got a Black client and I want to like do this, like what should I do? It's like, why don't you practice with your own people and then come over and try it with a person of color, right? And there's a lot of people that create environments for that. I did something with Resma Minikim, right, with some somatic abolitionist work, right? Like doing something to work on dismantling some of those pieces in yourself, doing some of that learning for yourself, so the information isn't new, the terminology isn't new, and then you can feel more confident when you try to enter the space, especially in the clinical aspect, right?
Absolutely. I love that, because it's like, I often say to, like, especially white folks, it's like, this is like the work, right? This is the work that needs to happen, to move us towards liberation. And I think there is a lot of kind of even trepidation sometimes by white colleagues to talk about race or how we're racialized. And I was like, but we need to talk about this, because if we can talk about this, we just keep perpetuating the same systems of harm. And so and even just knowing, how does your body mind like regulate or dysregulate around Black and brown folks, for example. I talk about that a lot with people, because sometimes there's even like, it's, like just really basic stuff, right? What is your tolerance for like more expansion and emotionality? Because, right, so much of whiteness is about tightness, and from a somatic perspective, right, tightness and policing and like, keeping everything compact and just keeping a lead on pretty much everything, it feels, right? Like, and so even just, and I think Resma talks about this actually too, in terms of like, just even notice kind of your nervous system regulation, because if you're not even aware of that, should you even be in a room with Black clients, honestly? So I love what you said. It's like, let's practice with one another first before we do any more harm in our field, which is also why it's so important to have more Black clinicians, more Black and brown clinicians and therapists and supervisors too, so the harm doesn't get perpetuated, if that makes sense.
Not 100% makes sense, but I think, I don't, don't quote me, but I think the numbers are like 4% of therapists are Black, right? So the reality is that most Black people don't have that option, right? And so it is really up to white folks to step into this.
Absolutely.
What I do like about Resma, is that really making them slow down in that space when you feel that uncomfortableness, and really getting comfortable with knowing what it feels like, right? Are your armpits sweating? Are you holding your breath? Like, what, he talks about the vibrations. How is your body vibrating in that? And almost using titration, right? To step in and step out of that comfortable, so you're not getting maxed out while trying.
Absolutely. And that is so important, because I often talk to, even some of my white supervisees, is like, when you're working with like, Black and brown clients, like, do you bring up race when it's relevant, right? There's been a lot of times where I was like, okay, here, did you say that to your client? And like, no, and you can see the tension in the body, right? You can see like the whole spine going up, the shoulder go up to the ear. And I'm like, okay, let's slow down. Let's take a breath. Why didn't you bring it up, right? It's like, what stopped you? What is the fear, right? And this fear, this perfectionism of white supremacy culture, right? What if I make a mistake? And I was like, well, yes, I want you to be careful. And also I don't want you to be so careful that then you have no relationship with your client, because then it's not an authentic connection, right? And like you said, I think sometimes I feel clinicians approach some of this work almost in this utilitarian way. I want to be more culturally competent, in air quote, right, to work with Black clients. But I'm like, I really want you to think about cultural attunement, actually, and really like, do you know yourself? And also, like, who do you surround yourself with, and what media do you consume, what books you read, what music do you listen to, who are your friends, like, right? It's way beyond the therapy room. I think for white folks to do that work has to be more expansive than just what we do in the therapy room. I don't know if that made any sense whatsoever. Sorry, I feel like I went on a little side quest there for a minute.
No, I think that does make sense. I was going to say something, I just lost my thought completely.
That's okay. Maybe I'll come back.
I hope it does.
Well, if in the meantime, and if it comes back, just jump in. But I love that you also mentioned education, because you do a lot of education. And because there is a very small percentage of Black and brown clinicians, you educate a lot of white people. What is that like for you to be in those spaces? Exactly, doing this. I saw that.
That was my friend, my breath again. I had to call my friend.
Yeah, we can be honest.
Oh yeah, I am honest. I also just want to note too, it's not just like academia, right?
No.
What I'm
Mhm.
doing is an intersection between critical race theory and
Yes.
sexology,
Yes.
right? Sex therapy, sex education,
Hmm.
there is a fight to keep both of those in curriculum,
Yep.
right? It's not widely accepted or supported.
Hmm.
And so on that, on top of my positionality, I think is the challenge. I wonder, if I was just
Yeah.
teaching nurses, would it be the same, right? Or, but if I'm teaching this particular content, I think puts a different level of spice on it for me.
Absolutely, because people are uncomfortable with all of this, right? They don't
Mm-hmm.
want to talk about race. They don't want to talk about sex. They don't want to
Mm-hmm.
talk about bodies, right? Like, and then you're like, let's talk about all of it. They
Yeah.
definitely don't want to talk about colonialism. The number of times I've been told, like, do you have to mention colonialism so much? Like, if we're just talking about gender, I was like, I sure do,
Oh, yeah,
right?
you do.
So it's all things that people don't want to talk about. So it cannot, like you
Mm-hmm.
said, it cannot be easy to work at the intersection of all those things that literally white supremacy and colonialism is like, let's just push them all aside and not think about them, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So how do you find that kind of that center, that kind of that will to keep educating people? Because it's a lot to educate
It
folks.
is. It
Hmm.
is a lot, and I've thought about retiring a couple of different times.
Yes.
Um, but I just taught for a BIPOC cohort of sex therapy
Hmm.
certificate students, and that was one of the most profound teaching experiences that I have ever had. How students were crying, saying they never had. I had several mixed people in the class. They said, I've never had anybody that looked like me teach a class
Hmm.
before, and how you held this space for us like nobody else has. Like, that was my intention, right? Was to
Yeah.
give you the experience that I didn't get that I wanted, right? And so being able to give that, and then seeing that it has that profound impact, that I'm helping them connect the dots early in their career, so
Hmm.
that I'm being a good ancestor to our field, so that these baby
Yes.
therapists are ready, to really have critical analysis around why and how we got here.
Absolutely. And I love that you mentioned being a good ancestor. I often think about, okay, what kind of ancestor do I want to be, right? How do I want to spend my time? Because, yeah, there are times where I'm like, I'm pretty sure there are easier things that we could do
Mm-hmm.
with our time, right? And
Mm-hmm.
maybe even more uh, like things that pay more money are less time consuming, are less soul crushing, right? And yet, right, it's also like this piece of, well, what do I want to leave the field, right? What kind of ancestor do I want to be for folks who come after me? And so I'm really interested in kind of what are your hopes for the field moving forward, right? Because you do give a lot to the field,
Mm-hmm.
right? You give your brilliant insight for your writing. You do clinical supervision, you educate people, you serve as a volunteer on committees and professional association. So, what is your hope for the future of our field?
Mm-hmm. I am actually hopeful, and I think maybe you can also understand why, coming from my lens of being a member of ASECT in 2011, was so much different
Yeah.
now, over a decade later, in the movement that has actually happened in
Mhm.
a decade, which I actually haven't seen that momentum in other organizations. I didn't feel um, like I had a home at ASECT at first,
Mhm.
and I very much tried to assimilate into that space, that white space, to be
Yeah.
accepted. And I would have never thought Like that, if I look back at that Anne who was working so hard to try to fit in, I would have never known that we have a Black president. That's a woman, a Black president elect right now, right? A board
Mm-hmm.
full of gender expansive
Yeah.
folks, right? We have so many different positionalities like being represented now,
Mm-hmm.
that just gives me hope. I'm like, oh, and I don't feel like it's on me anymore. I feel like even the
Mm-hmm.
people under us are now the ones that have to, really do the
Absolutely.
heavier
Mm-hmm.
lifting of moving it, and that I've already seen like a mountain be moved. And if it just continues at this pace, I mean, I think more than my imagination can think of might happen for us.
Mm-hmm. I'm with you. I'm like, sometimes when I look back, I'm like, wow, like change has happened pretty fast, right? When I see Dr. Lex in leadership at ASEC as president, right? Like you said, the field is changing, right? There's still a lot of work to do, but
A lot.
I'm with you. I can't even imagine what will it be like in 10 or 20 years. Hopefully, even more mountains will get moved, right? At least I sure hope so.
I feel
Yeah.
like it's going to be the younger people telling me to get it together. Like, you need to take this training. You need to.
Yes.
I'm like, okay, let me catch up.
I'm looking forward to that. I know my friend Colleen, who died back in 2019. I remember them saying, like, I just want to be one of those ancestors who are like obsolete, and people look back and go, oh my God, what were they thinking? Like, that was so antiquated, right? That was so not radical. But, and I was like, yes, I really feel that. I want people to look at me and go, oh, you're a little behind the times now, Alex. Here's like where you need to like catch up. And I think that is beautiful, right? We want to be pushed by the younger generation coming after us to do even better, to think even bigger, to dream even larger dreams than we could ever imagine. Absolutely. I love that. I want to be respectful of your time. I feel like there's so many conversations that you and I could have. I was like, we haven't even talked about the fact that, you're Black and also Italian American. We have a little Italian connection. We haven't even talked about like our cultural connection, right? And I'm so curious. I feel like that could be a whole other episode to talk about the
Yeah.
intersection there. But like I said, I want to be respectful of your time. And I always ask people, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you were hoping that we would talk about today? Or
Mm.
anything that you're like, as I think about this conversation, this bit is missing, or I really want to mention this.
Well, I want to just make sure that too, that I want to connect the dots here as we talk about like connecting
Mm-hmm.
the dots, and it's going to be like a broad stroke of connecting dots, but just understanding that piece about colonization isn't just about like Black bodies. It's not just about
Yes.
our gender. It's about every part of our existence and how we are in relationship to each other, which relationships we think are acceptable, how many people can
Mm.
be in those relationships, um, the race that we will partner with, like
Yes.
all these things, right? Even our access to employment is just intrinsically tied to the history.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So I think that people think, oh, it's just this one thing. It's like, no, it's like all of the things of where we are and how we consider family, how we consider
Yes.
work, like everything has a
Absolutely.
historical basis.
And I love that because I think often people think about things in kind of, and that's part of also white supremacy and colonialism, like this chunks, right? But it is pervasive and it's all connected, like it's the whole ecosystem, right? And it's, yeah, when you were saying that, I was like, oh, I feel like we could spend, hours and hours going, yeah, it's about things that people think are fixed, like who are we attracted to, the choices we make. Actually, all of those are kind of shaped by history and shaped by those constructs. And often people think that those things are just innate, right? And I'm like, actually, there is a lot that we've internalized from all this messaging that, and the history that we carry with us. And we need to really, like you said, it's unplugging from the matrix and going, whoa, this is everywhere, right? It's like whether I watch reality TV or I'm working with clients or walk in nature, and even who gets to be in nature and feel safe while being in nature, right? Like I know here in Minnesota, there are a lot of initiatives to make sure that Black and Brown folks, for example, feel more comfortable in state parks and other natural spaces because history, right? And I think that folks, like you said, often don't make that connection that it's everything. It's everything in our day to day is impacted. Mhm. Absolutely. I know that I said that was the last question, but I'm going to ask you one more question because we are coming up to election season where we live. And I think that people are feeling a certain kind of heaviness. And so I'm not going to ask you a political question, but I'm going to ask you just how are you resourcing yourself during this time? Because, I feel like in some ways, not that this is not going on all the time, but it's amplified when elections get closer, right? Especially presidential elections. And so how are you just like, you've made some good examples of like taking care of yourself, but how are you finding some joy, some expansiveness, some pleasure in your life? Let's talk about pleasure. We're sex therapists. How are you finding some access to comfort and pleasure and expansion in your life right now?
Well, two things come to mind. I used to have very busy mornings. I get ready, cook the breakfast, do the emails and all of the things. And I've now stopped doing all things except for just getting kiddo to school in the morning. That's my only thing we do. So I can cook whatever, I can do her hair or whatever it is, but it's really just slowing down and keeping that priority of, again, going back to that, this is the center, my home, my family, making sure my kiddo is happy when she goes to middle school, right? Has been an anchor. And then I have a lot of like anger and confusion and other, like I can feel it. I'm tapping into it as I'm trying to like recall it. I was just listening to the news right before we hopped on, right? And listening to like who is voting for what and why, and just getting really frustrated. And one thing that I feel like is helping me in this area is I also started weight training. Because I will channel that like little bit of anger. I will channel that stupid comment that I heard, or that channel that fear that I'm walking amongst 50% of people that think a completely different way that I do. And how can you ever be safe? Like channeling all that into just really pushing a weight. And then I can feel that like softening in my body. It's like my body doesn't have to hold that because it just exerted that in a really angry way
I love
out of
that.
my body.
I love that. And I could almost feel like the pleasure of pushing that out, right? And it's like, you don't have to hold it in your body. Absolutely. That's beautiful.
Yeah. And I feel really strong after, like stronger mentally. Like, okay, I can hold that my planet is a shit show right now in this moment.
Yeah, I love that so much. Well, like I said, there's probably like 500 other conversations I want to have with you, but for now, we're coming towards the end of our time together for this episode. And so, if people are like, maybe they're in your state and they would like to work with you, or maybe they want to get supervision from you, or they want to find your books, how can they find you online?
Yeah, I'm Googleable on all of the things. So
Great.
just my name, it's Anne with an E and Mauro. And I have ways on my site to reach out with me, and I'm on all of the social interwebs.
That's right. You're on Instagram. I love following you on Instagram. I think you are. I am Anne Mauro, right? On Instagram. Is that your handle? And don't worry, listeners, we'll put all those links to Anne's website and the book and the Instagram on the episode description. But also, if people are like, I never look at the episode description, I always like to make sure that people have talked about where you can be found as well. Well, and this has been, unsurprisingly, because you're amazing, an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your time and your wisdom and your insight. I appreciate you so much.
Thank you. I will take any opportunity to talk with you at any time, Alex. You know that. So
Oh,
it was my pleasure to share this space with you.
I feel just the same. So that's beautiful. Well, and dear Gender Stories listeners or watchers, if you're watching on YouTube nowadays, as always, thank you for supporting the podcast, for listening. And, until next time, please take care of yourself and find some expansiveness and some rest in your own lives too. Until next time.